Seated. Shabbat Shalom. One of my favorite parts of the Haggadah is a passage that is probably one of the first, if not the first, that will be cut out for time. And if you were to ask me what parts you can skip because you want your Seder to be completed at a reasonable time, I would agree and say, yes, this is probably one of the first things that should go. I call this section Multiplying Like Rabbis, where we find a midrash where Rabbi Yossi takes a verse from this week's parsha that we read at the very end, Exodus 8:15, where Pharaoh's magicians tell him that the third plague, the plague of lice, which they were unable to replicate, unlike all the earlier plagues, they tell Pharaoh, this plague, Etzba Elohim hi, it is the finger of God. And they don't specify which finger. But Rabbi Yossi compares this verse to a verse a few chapters later, which we'll read 2 weeks from now, Parashat Vaera, Exodus 14:31, where the children of Israel, having just been saved from the sea of reeds, quote, saw the great hand which Adonai had laid upon the Egyptians. If there were 10 plagues in Egypt, where the finger of God was seen, then Rabbi Yossi concludes at the sea, where they see the hand of God, they must have been 50 plagues. But wait, there's more, because the Haggadah then brings in Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, who each bring in their own understanding of Psalm 78:49, which describes the plagues in Egypt as God's fierce anger, wrath, fury, and trouble, a band of evil angels. Rabbi Eliezer sees this verse as listing 4 things, meaning 40 plagues in Egypt and 200 at the sea, while Rabbi Akiva sees this as 5 distinct things, meaning 50 plagues in Egypt, 250 at the sea. This section raises a lot of questions. They don't have easy answers. Questions like, what? Why? What is this midrash doing here? Why is this part of the Haggadah? Another question you could ask, that also doesn't have an easy answer, is, Rabbi, why do you like this section so much? To all of this I say, I don't really know. The midrashim that are quoted here are really old. They're really old midrashim. They're found in the Mechilta, which dates back to the early 3rd century CE, about the same time as the Mishnah. But they are very late additions to the Haggadah. Early midrash, late in the Haggadah. They serve as a bridge between the listings of the plagues and the singing of Dayenu. In fact, really you should see this section as the introduction to Dayenu, as the early Haggadot that don't have this section also don't have Dayenu. If you have Dayenu, you have this section. So we can see these pieces together, the multiplication of the plagues and Dayenu, which is the great elaboration of all of our blessings. All of it is really an elaboration on God's power, both to do ill, as we see with the plagues, and to do good, as all the blessings we recite in Dayenu. So perhaps this is the beginning of an answer. Although I feel there is something more, because again, this is one of my favorite parts, but if you ask me why, I don't think this is quite a satisfying answer. So again, I don't know. What was it about this part? Although maybe the fact that when we were growing up, when we got to this part, we'd always say, evil angels. Yeah, that might be part of it. But really, until I started writing this sermon, I had not really looked into why this bizarre little section of Haggadah appealed to me so much. Each year it comes up, and we read it, and I think for a minute how odd it is and how I really like it. I don't know why. I wonder for a minute, but then we're singing Dayenu, and soon after that we're eating the Hillel sandwich, and this section on multiplication is tabled for another year. Sometimes the jokes sometimes you have to think about it. But having thought about it for this sermon, I think a big part of the appeal, for me personally, comes from that verse we read today, where the Egyptian magicians, unable to replicate the plague of lice, tells Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." See, of all the Jewish ritual objects, the yod is probably my favorite. And when looking at graphic design, I've always been drawn to the manicule, which is that floating hand with the index finger pointing in marginalia in medieval manuscripts or those 19th century printed posters. So the finger of God, it's an interesting image. So commentators have different understandings, of course, about what the magicians mean when they say this line. Some, like Rashi, see it as the magicians admitting defeat, acknowledging this plague is truly divine power that they don't have access to. Others, like Ibn Ezra, see this more as the magicians saying that this is just a natural phenomenon. It has nothing to do with Moses and Aaron, therefore it would have nothing to do with them, therefore it's not a big deal that they can't do it. It's just a natural thing. Don't worry about it, Pharaoh. Regardless of what these magicians meant, regardless of that, whether it's admitting defeat or excusing their temporary, they think, setback, when they say this is the finger of God, I think they're saying something true beyond what they understand. Earlier, I joked about which of the fingers this is, but for me, I think we know which finger it is. It's the index finger. It's pointing. This finger of God is the manicule. It's the pointing finger in the marginalia directing our eye to the important text. It's this finger of God, which is the same finger in the yod that we use to read from the Torah. It's an indexical, a thing that is used to point beyond itself. And that, I think, is truly what the plagues are. The plagues are there to point beyond, for Pharaoh and the Egyptians to see that there is a power beyond the human, the power that created the world. In Pirkei Avot 5:1, we read, God created the world with 10 utterances. Now, the Maharal of Prague took those 10 utterances and showed that each of the plagues corresponds to one of those utterances of creation. So, for example, the plague of frogs, which we read today, refers to God's statement in Genesis 1:20, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. And it goes on and on. Each plague lines up with one of these statements. And taken this way, the plagues can be seen as an act of uncreation, demonstrating that when human beings think they are the ultimate authority, think that they have the power to enslave others, creation is destroyed and returned to primordial chaos. The plagues are pointing back to those moments of creation with a message that there is a creator. It's pointing. And this finger of God is not just pointing us to God as the divine power that created the universe. It's also pointing to God, the divine power that makes moral demands of us. Does anyone here know where else this phrase, Etzba Elohim, finger of God, appears in the Torah? There's two other places. Exodus 31:18 and Deuteronomy 9:10. In both of these verses, we learn that the tablets, which the 10 commandments were written on, were inscribed by the finger of God. So the finger the magicians see is not just pointing to the past. It's not just pointing to creation. It is pointing to the future, to the revelation at Sinai and the commandments. And the Hasidic master, the Sfat Emet, makes this connection between these three sets of 10 explicit. He writes, God initially created the world with these 10 utterances in a manner that hid the divine within. The 10 plagues uproot the 10 utterances and replaces them with the 10 commandments, which reveal the divine within the world. The plagues remind us of the power behind creation, and that power also expects us to behave justly and morally. When we don't, creation breaks. And that creation can only be repaired when we commit ourselves to our mutual obligations to each other and to God. All of this from the pointing finger. In some ways, I think we could say our entire tradition. The entire tradition is a pointing finger. Everything, if we see it properly, is pointing us beyond ourselves. If we could just move our eyes beyond to what it's referring to. So going back to this numbers game, I believe it's telling us there are signs all around us pointing the way. A way back to creation, a way forward to freedom and obligations. And maybe these things could be seen negatively in the plagues. But immediately after we have Dainu, showing us that the signs are also in the miraculous gifts as well. So think about Rabbi Cunan's question when we harden our hearts. The plagues harden Pharaoh's heart. And in the Haftorah, we see the Pharaoh in the Haftorah say, the Nile is mine. He's seeing the benefits and he's hardening his heart there too. So we can see these signs and miracles that are all around us, positive, negative, but I pray we're able to see them, the good and the bad. We're able to see all of it as the finger of God, pointing us forward. Shabbat Shalom.